Cool. Hi everyone. My name is Vinayak, and today we have the panelists, and we're going to talk about building business around open source projects. Um, uh, I work as a C2 assistant at Microsoft for startups, and we have Abhishek Nayak, who is the co-founder of Appsmith. We have Pranav Raj, who's towards the end of the stage, which is founder of Chatwood, and beside him we have Pranay Pratik, who is a co-founder of Signos. So maybe what we can do is, if we can quickly start by with you, Pranav, if you can tell us a little bit about about your journey. How did you start? How did you assess the problem space, and how your FOSS project actually solves it? Yeah.
Hello, everyone. Thanks. First of all, thanks for giving me this opportunity to be here. So my name is Pranav. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Chatwood. At Chatwood, we are building an open source customer engagement platform as an alternative to Intercom or Zendesk or any other customer support platforms out there. So yeah, our journey is a little bit unconventional. We started as a proprietary software. We were building it to solve one of our use cases. Then we thought, okay, we'll make it as a product. We'll see how it goes. We tried a couple of things, but it didn't work out as a product, as a business. So shut it down. Later, after 2 years, we were just interested in the problem space. So we tried to understand more about the type of users and the solutions they would require, and we were actually seeing a lot of interest in GitLab version of Intercom, which was an open source Intercom only. So so we thought okay, we have this code base which we could use. Why don't we try this? And that's how we started as an open source project. And I think it has been an amazing journey because when we started, it was just like an open source project. We put the code out, nobody cared, and afterwards, a month after that, we started getting a lot of attention, and then one day we launched it on Hacker News, and that was the place where people started to know more about us, and they started contributing. Yeah, I think that's mostly it.
Pranay, if you can.
Sure. Hey folks, I'm Pranay. I'm co-founder at Signos. So Signos is an open source observability platform. We help developers monitor their applications and troubleshoot any problems they face. So observability is just a fancy word for if you're running anything on cloud or in a production environment, how do you know is it working well? Are all systems running fine? Are your applications performing as they should, right? And yeah, so the journey of how we started was very interesting. So it sort of came from the problem I was facing. So I was product lead at a startup here in Bangalore, and sort of the engineering team reported to me. And what we were seeing was whenever something would go down in the application on the site, right? People would start asking me that, hey, I would get call from customer care that, hey, something is breaking, and then why don't you look into it, right? And then basically we have to figure out what's going wrong, but we didn't have the good toolings around it. So what I basically did, I had to get all people together, all my engineering leads together in a room and sort of try to debug the where's the problem, so sort of in a war room mode, right? And that journey was very painful, right? And I'm sure many of the software developers here would understand whenever something breaks, it's very painful because the management is on your shoulder to find the issue quickly, right? So that's where you realize that this is a very burning problem, and as more and more companies are becoming more reliant on software, and software is their core product, this problem would increase, right? And when we started looking into the market, what's the problem?
Can you just hold the mic close to you?
Sure. So when we started looking into the market, what's the, there were some proprietary tools out there, but not everybody was using it, right? And so that's where we started thinking about can we sort of make this problem, make the solution accessible to everyone, right? So that instead of you going to a sort of signing up and then talking to account manager to sign up a software and then start using it, you can just sort of download the code and start running with it, right? And if you have any problem, you start with go to the GitHub, this is community around it. And like being developers ourselves, we prefer that model a lot more compared to like talking to like emailing account manager, going on call with them, right? So that's sort of the ethos we started with, and yeah, so that's sort of the idea we applied to Y Combinator. Y Combinator is a startup accelerator based out of US, and we got accepted. And till post that, we have had a phenomenal journey. We started writing our first line of code after getting into YC. We launched the product in like 4 or 5 months down the line. So we launched the product in March 2021. We launched it on Hacker News. We had great reception in terms of like we got around, I think 300 plus comments on it. So at least that told us that like there's some interest in the problem space which we are targeting, and like also lots of feedback from the community. And like today, like around 1.5 years now, we are at like 7,000 GitHub stars, 1,100 plus Slack community members, and yeah, doing well. And that's been our journey.
Yeah, Abhishek, you can just pass the mic. Tell us about your startup and maybe also a little bit about journey, and how at what point did you start with the code first, or was the community? How did the product come along?
Sounds good. Thank you. So I'm Abhishek. I'm one of the co-founders of Appsmith. So Appsmith is an open source CRUD application builder or an admin panel builder. It's very flexible. You can drag and drop things to create the UI and then connect to any data source. So at the core, it's solving a very common problem that has existed for a long time. We started working on this idea, rather my co-founder started working on this idea when our previous startup was not working out. This originated from the ashes of my previous startup where we had built a mobile game. That mobile game went viral. Over a period of 4 months, we saw over 1 million downloads, 120,000 plus DAUs playing it every day. And to keep the lights on, we had to build a lot of these sort of admin panels. We were using Bootstrap themes, Django admin, sometimes something is completely custom. And all of this was being built by my co-founder, Arpit, who's a backend engineer and really dislikes working on front-end and HTML, CSS. So he had started thinking of building a more flexible Django admin as a side project while this mobile game startup was going on. Ultimately, this startup did not work out. We had to end it. Arpit and I, we went our separate ways. He then had started working on this idea on the side at his new company, which was Kyofit. And that's where he realized there's a lot of potential for something like this if he did it as a full-fledged startup instead of just as a side project. After that, after about 7 or 8 months of us shutting our first startup, that's when I think we started writing code. We started working with a few early users of the product. Almost all of them churned out because the open source project was not very good. Then we took a whole year to get it right and we launched it. And after that is when it actually started taking off. So we launched our project about 20 months ago. And since then it's been growing well. We are at nearly 20,000 GitHub stars and about 7,000 plus teams that use us every month.
So I'm seeing a theme here, right? A lot of you might not know, but the photo sharing site called Flickr. I mean, Stewart Butterfield, and Katharina Fick started building a game, and the game didn't take off. But they had this photo sharing component of it that kind of became very popular, and they built Flickr. Stewart Butterfield, in his second attempt at building a game, also started doing that, and he focused on the messaging part. Again, that messaging part also became very interesting, and that's how Slack came about. So I'm seeing a theme here, right? There's a mobile game, and then there's an offshoot, and then you build enterprise software, which is a completely different ball game. Also, maybe you can you elaborate a little bit on what is the licensing that you use? Do you have an open core policy, and also do you have like a contributor license agreement? How do you manage the contributions that come in from the community as well?
Sure. So we have an Apache 2.0 license. Now we charge for people who use our cloud-hosted edition. We also charged a few people for support, and the other way that we make money is by providing a enterprise/business edition, which uses the open source product at its core, but there are some proprietary features on top of it, which has a proprietary license. So those are the 3 ways by which we do it.
Okay, Pranay.
Sure. So we have an MIT license. and you can download the code. It's completely free to run. As of now, we don't have any proprietary software, but like we plan to launch enterprise product, which will have an enterprise more proprietary license. And yeah, primarily it's a open source core with a enterprise offering on top of it.
Yeah, I think I'll just add to the points which both of you guys have mentioned. I think the question would also be how do you monetize the project, right? There are different ways. I think one way could be the way which Abhishek mentioned, where you can host the solution yourself and then provide it to your users and charge for that. One another way which we are doing is that we have an MIT license code which is available for everyone, which is open source, which can be used without any restrictions. And we have a source available enterprise edition software, which we charge for. So we charge based on the number of agents who are using the platform. So yeah.
Cool. Also, do you have when other people contribute to your code, how do you manage the contribute? Do you have a CLA in place? If you can quickly answer.
No, I think this was one of the most debated item which we had in our company. So one is basically you have to be compliant, at least in future you wouldn't have any issues. So what we went with was we went with DCO. We didn't go with CLA because personally as a developer I myself didn't like it, and GitLab has a good example of how you can take it forward. So we went ahead with DCO instead of CLA.
Cool. What about you, Pranay?
Yeah, so as of now, because our source was completely free and open source, we didn't have a CLA or DCO, but we are as of now deciding which path to take.
And you Abhishek?
Same for a similar situation. We also debated on CLA and we ended up not going ahead with it because there was some internal disagreements about how should it be. So far, we've not done anything about it yet.
Yeah, if you can, quickly tell what were the sides of the debates. I'm sure other people in the audience might be kind of going through the same thing or might face that. So, what are the pros and cons? We can quickly.
Sure. So if I remember, one of the things that we were worried was people who work at other companies, they couldn't contribute without getting the CLA approved by somebody else. So that was something that was a huge issue. How should the CLA be drafted? That was again something we didn't have a good opinion on.
Okay.
And so far we have around, I believe, about 120 plus external contributors.
Okay.
A lot of the contributions are small. They're not anything too big, and we realized we should probably tackle it a little bit later, which I think for us will be over the next 2 quarters.
Okay. Yeah, I think there is this debate going on in those of you who are part of the FOSS United, is that did the code come first or did the community come first? What was it in your case? So you can quickly answer that and then we'll kind of pivot to the community questions. Yeah.
Yeah, for us, code comes first, and code came first, then came the community. So the community which we have right now is mostly product enthusiasts. It's a closely built product community. So yeah, for us, it's first the product came, then the community came.
Pranay?
Yeah, for us too. Code came first, and then we started.
Abhishek?
So for us, while we were coding and building the product out, like I said, we initially gave it to a few users. They hated it. They never used it. And we went back and started working on the product for a whole year. During that period, I'm not a developer. I was the only business person in the founding team. I was very focused on building a community of sorts.
The early adopter.
The early adopters. So we created a newsletter. It got up to around 850 subscribers, and all the subscribers were developers.
Okay.
The idea was when we actually launch, we can use that newsletter to get some users and get that done. When we actually launched, we sent an email out, and I think out of 850, we got around 30 opens, and maybe 5 or 6 people clicked the link. So all the work that I had done for an entire year around it did not work for us. And very quickly we realized our community can only grow around the product. And I can't have a community of developers that are interested in other things that I say, and then I pivot and convince them, hey, I'm trying to sell you something else, you should go try this out. That didn't work for us. So we immediately stopped any efforts on building community outside of users of our product.
So I think a follow-up question to you would be, how does it help with contributions and recruiting? How do you balance both the commercial concern, because all three of you mentioned that you have taken money from VCs, right? So how do you balance the both the community and commercial concerns? How do you, for example, prioritize features, right? Because there will be paying customers and they will be saying, hey, you know what, like I'm paying you for this product and I want my features to be done. And on the other side, you might have people in the community saying that, hey, maybe this is not the right direction to take, right? So how do you kind of balance, right? Because this kind of conflict in some sense, if I were to use that word, is at the center of, doing a startup in open source.
Yeah, I think this conflict is something that I'm very aware of, and it's something that will, I think, affect us a lot more once we grow larger. As of today, we have a very clear product roadmap that's defined by us, and we don't have a sales-led method of acquiring customers. The only customers who've been paying for Appsmith support or proprietary edition have been users of our open source edition who then graduated to paying for something. And that's how we believe we'll generate at least most of our early revenue, at least up to like the first 10 million or so we expect it to come from our open source user base itself. The main thing is my two co-founders, they're strong engineers who are very careful about what features to commit to and what features not to commit to. So far, we've not run into this issue where we've had to work on something because a paying customer is asking us for it, because we don't promise any features that are not on our roadmap already. So that has helped us. But I'm very sure this discussion and debate will become more complicated in a few years for us.
Cool. Pranay?
Yeah, so the way we think about it is that if you are here to build big project and a big company which like everybody uses, right? Because there's a problem which everybody has. We have to create a lot of value and sort of capture a part of it, right? And sort of investing in the open source, until now we are like only open source, we don't have any enterprise, provides us a way to show the community that, hey, there's a value in the product, and we are fine if like nobody pays for it, right? Because if we are sure that if we are able to create decent amount of value, then we'll be able to capture something around that, right? And this is something which I had a call with Sid, who is founder of GitLab. This is what basically told me, right? That, hey, you are starting an open source company, right? Essentially, you will be able to capture a much smaller portion of value you generate. Proprietary companies, for example, maybe capture 80% of the values they generate, while you will generate only 10 or 20%, right? But the way to counter that is that you create much larger volume of value and then try to capture part of it. And that's how we think about it, that, hey, if you're deciding on any feature or like what to build next, we have to balance that the open source community has big enough things to like work on. And then if there are like demands from enterprises, we'll cater to that also, but only if the open source community is healthy and there's like enough things, it's a usable product and people can use it as they want.
Yeah, I think for me it's like, how do you prioritize? That's the question, right? So for me it's mostly, you want to understand what are your goals, right? For example, you want to get more and more open source adoption, then in that case, you have to prioritize more and more community requests, or maybe something that actually triggers more of the open source adoption. And if you want to do more of revenue, you have to figure out more and more enterprise feature or more and more features that people can pay you. So it's more about what is your North Star metric, what is the one thing which you want to optimize for? Is it for the adoption? Is it for the revenue? And based on that, you have to take a decision. And I'd like to say, you'd have to prioritize like an auto wala in Bangalore. you get like tens of thousands of like, people who might be from different, category, different type of companies, different segments. So you would want to pick that one set of company or like, one set of users who you would want to do more with. And I think like, a good example is how a person like, an auto wala would take you in, like if you walk around the street and they might like they would ask you like whether you want to go to HSR or like somewhere, and they would pick that right person who and optimize for time, effort, and money. And based on your North Star metric, you would have to prioritize.
Yeah, so follow up to that would be like, since you're open source, one part is the community, but you also have competitors, right? You will have proprietary competitors, and they can once see your source code. They can also maybe see your maybe if you have especially if you are like on GitHub or something, you can also create a prioritized list of features that you have. So they can in some sense see your roadmap. So how do you is it a disadvantage? And if it's a disadvantage, how do you counter that?
Yeah, I don't think it is a disadvantage, and I take the example of GitLab, right? Like, GitHub can see everything, but does that affect GitLab? No. So I think it's a good thing because, like, to me personally, like, being open source is a very good thing because it's transparent by its design, right? Your discussions, your thought process, everything is documented public, and people can see and understand what the problem they are solving. And I don't think it is that, like, even if somebody else sees your roadmap, right, like, it wouldn't affect you in a very bad way because, like, because they might have their own priorities, and like, if they're a big company, it takes another like, year or two, which you'd have taken like, 1 month or 2 months to build, right? So I mean, I don't see it as a disadvantage, and I haven't found any good examples like, which would have like,
So in some sense, open source helps you be like very nimble in that sense.
Yeah, I mean,
you can react faster because users are telling exactly. Sometimes you may not like it, but they tell exactly what they want, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So the feedback is very immediate. Sometimes also very drastic, also.
Yeah, I mean, feedback is like, it's you can get it in like, in both ways where, you might get a good feedback as well as like, people might be very frustrated that
why is my feature not being implemented? I have been like at this for like a year, right?
Yeah.
So you get users like that as
yeah,
well.
I mean, recently, like 2 days back, one guy came to one of our issues and said, like, this issue is open for 3 years. you haven't looked at it, which happens. I mean, there was a thread as well, like, somebody actually went to a 10-year old issue and said, like, whether this is done or not. So yeah, I mean, that can happen. You get trolls or like, but it's part of it. It's always part of how you build. Thanks.
Pranay?
Yeah, so I have an interesting story to share here. So our product is also open source and our website is also open source, right? So I think 3-4 months back, we had somebody who like had copied our website completely, just replaced the name of the brand. So instead of Signos, they would put something else, and then it was live somewhere, right? And one of our team members discovered it somewhere in some forum, and he was like, "Oh God, what's happening? These guys have like copied this everything." And I was like also very worried that, hey, like, what's happening? Somebody's like just stealing our business, right? And then my co-founder was saying that, hey, look, if somebody is stealing or like trying to copy you, in a way it's good. Like stealing is the best sort of like applaud, right? Because they liked it so much, they are like stealing you. And then we like let it play. Like we left it like we and didn't do anything about it, right? Though I was like very scared about it for like 2-3 days. Ki what will happen? I think they posted on Reddit or Hacker News also. But thankfully, like nothing happened, and like after a week or so, like nobody cares about it, right? Today I don't know if there's that site is still there, right? So I think the learning there is like there will be people who will try to copy, but if they're just copying you as a code, the whole project is just not the code, right? Like it's the people behind it. It's like the mission which you are trying to solve. It's like where we want to go. It's the people who are sort of helping us go there. It's the community which we have around us, right? And that you can't copy. So code, in a way, like open source, because we are open sourcing the code, in a way, we are saying that, hey, like code is just one part of this there's like lot more stakeholders there, lot more things, or like many assets which you have, right? And so from that time onwards, I am like, don't focus on competition, focus on our customers, right? If some customer is saying you that, hey, your product is not working, that's the main thing we have to address. And like focus on community, how we can make them more useful, we can make the product more useful for them. And if there's a competitor they want to copy, it's like, it's a praise for us, and it's like they don't have any other better idea than to copy us, which is fine.
Yeah, so as it is said, imitation is the best form of flattery, right? So I also heard you say that, okay, I mean, the code came first, but the community is what kept the code working in some sense, right? Abhishek?
Yeah, so I have a really interesting story here. I like to say Appsmith's engineering team is responsible for 2 venture-funded startups, because one is the Appsmith project itself, but we also have a competitor who's sort of directly competing with us as a proprietary product. What they did was they took our open source code base, added up a lot more features on top of it, and essentially managed to make a product which is more feature rich than Appsmith is, but it's proprietary. And they ended up raising money from some investors that we had already been speaking to. So we were really surprised to see that happen. But at the same time, I think it was nice to see that somebody thought our code base was good enough to use that at the core of their product. And I believe this will keep happening to us. But adding to what Pranay and Pranav were saying, there's definitely a lot more to a product than just the code base itself. Code is very contextual. The architecture that you choose is again contextual. If somebody is taking all of that, they might also be taking your mistakes with them and applying it to a context where it's not relevant. So these sort of things, I think I'm not so worried about, and they'll keep happening for sure. And I think it's okay.
Yeah, so what I also hear from you is that in some sense, in VC language, community is the moat, right? So every VC are like, well, how is your product defensible? What is the moat? And community is the moat. So with that, I want to pivot to investors, right? So how do you manage to once convince your investors and get funding from them? That is the first part. And once they're given funding, to convince them that working with the community, keeping it open source, and also working with the community is an effort toward doing. So how is that journey? The education of investors and also getting that funding. If you can talk a little bit about that, yeah.
Yeah, sure. So in our case, in case of Appsmith, we've raised a seed, Series A, and a Series B very recently. All the first, our seed and our Series A investors, both the partners that we work with, they were engineers. And they were engineers for a very long time before entering the VC world, so they understand the aspect of open source. And the third investor who invested in a Series B had invested in multiple open source projects, including GitLab, which now is public. So they are all investors who get it and who understand the importance of a really thriving open source product plus community. So most of our conversations, especially right now that we've raised Series B, is actually our investors are not in a hurry for us to push for enterprise features or for revenue growth. They actually expect us to spend more time on making the open source product better. So in that sense, we've not had conflicts yet. I do believe as a company grows bigger, as you have different investors, some of these conflicts will arise, but it's very much, these conflicts get resolved if at the very start of your journey with them, your opinions and your principles are very clear to them.
Sure.
The conflicts arise if you change your principles midway or you don't have them in the first place. So in our case, we do make these principles clear, and we end up attracting people who believe in those same principles. And if they don't believe in it, then we just go try to work with somebody else.
No, great. And also, before I move to Pranay, I think the takeaway for me is that if you're a startup and you're building company and a startup around open source, I think choosing your investors wisely, as in like you said, I think 2 pointers there. One was that they have an engineering background, so they understand from an engineering point of view what you're doing, and also if they worked with such companies, so the amount of effort that you kind of spend in education becomes less because they have seen and been through the journey of other startups, so you're not starting from scratch. Pranay?
Yeah, I think for us, fundamentally the domain we are in, it's pretty huge. Like there have been billion-dollar companies in this space. So people understand that, at least the investor understands that if a project really takes off, you can build a big business here, right? And so the focus has always been on how do you sort of get adoption, and can open source and sort of the community be a way to get there, right? And I think the investors who have like sort of partnered with us are those who fundamentally believe that, hey, this is a way which can work for this domain. And because fundamentally we are a very hardcore data product, like hardcore infrastructure product, right? And in this space, if you have to build something, like build a big community around it, you need to go open source. And so that's what we have sort of filtered for in investors, that people who get this would be a good partner, and people who sort of don't understand this may not be the right fit for us, right? And we may not be the right fit for them, right? So sort of the main thing here is filtering the people you want to work with, and do they understand the vision which you are going forward with. And there has been success in building great open source companies, right? So there's GitLab, there's HashiCorp. So there's a proven business path for it on how these projects can become big and also become a viable big business. It's just that, does the other person or does the investor whom you are interacting with have that like mindset, and does he believe in it? And that's what we filter for.
Yeah, I think it's more about educating people. I think the success of GitLab and HashiCorp has done a lot. Like I've seen investors who passed GitLab, who's not chosen to invest. Then they are regretting it now because they could have made a fortune once if they have done that. But having said that, I think this is actually a success story in US. People in India still didn't see a good company that came out as a public company which is an open source company from India. So people
has someone like maybe having like a Hasura or a Postman help in the ecosystem?
Yeah, I think their success would eventually help a lot, because people would get more and more comfortable investing in such companies. I think this is more about they're also taking risks, right? How do I reduce risks? For us, I think since people who are our investors, have seen open source companies, have used open source products before, have been founders before. So for them, it was a natural choice, because all they care about is whether you could build $1 billion business out of it. If you have an answer, I think they wouldn't actually really care about whether you're open source or not. So having that story, having that conviction is something which is really important.
Cool. Before I open it up to the audience, I had one last question. Mostly, what advice would you give developers and or business people who want to build your startup around an open source? As in, what do you feel that you should have known, when you started this journey, both as a open source project and also maybe as a company, building a company around it?
As an engineer, it might find a little bit hard to understand as well. Code actually doesn't really matter. It's actually the product which people use. Even if you're solving a problem, what problem you are solving is important. It's not about how you execute it, whether it is in PHP, whether it is in Ruby, or whether it is in JS. There are certain cases languages matter, the way you code matters, but most of the cases it's the quality of the product you are delivering, it's the quality of the content you are delivering which matters. So I think as an engineer, if I would have that conviction before, then it would have been better, because the thought process would have been very different. The entire thing would have been different. Yeah.
I think one of the things which I notice, which many people ask me, that is should I open source my project, right? And I think many people believe that open sourcing something leads to sort of adoption and success, whatever. Right? What I urge them to do is sort of evaluate their situation and their belief in this, right? Because if it's not just that the whole project or the community comes on its own, right? You have to invest in it. So even for us, right, we invest in community, interacting with the community, understanding them, our engineers' time or our team's time, which we could have as well built on a invested on building products if we had been in a proprietary product, right? But we don't want to do that because that's sort of the broader goal which we have taken, that, hey, we want to build with the community, we want to build it for the long term and take everybody with us, right? But that may not be the case for like each one of you, right? Or like that may not also be relevant for your domain. So at least for us, we are a very dev-focused product. So sort of our users are also developers. So they understand the value of being open source, and sort of that gets us interest, right? But for example, if you're an HR tech product, like just an example, nothing against HR tech, but if you're an HR tech product, how will open source help you, right? So those are the questions you should ask yourself. Do you really want to commit to building an open source? Because there are like other sides of it, right? You have to keep everything in public. All of us have sort of all the issues, etc., in public. So anybody can see like if something is wrong with your code. That's like both plus and minus, because you can get feedback from the community and like know about things which you don't know, but also like it's like your dirty linen in the public, right? So are you comfortable with that? So I think that's one of the things which I want to leave people with, that do you really believe in this? Do you want to play it for the long term, or are you just trying to do this for like getting adoption? I think there are like different ways to get adoption. Open source may not apply for everybody.
Yeah, so I don't do open source only for the distribution mechanism. Abhishek?
Yeah, so my point here is like giving most of your product away for free is not like a get rich quick scheme. It's probably the slowest way of making money and revenue. So if you do have to, focus on revenue and that's important for you, I think it's just way better to start with something proprietary. And because doing open source to me has felt like doing two different startups. First, you have to have a free product that people like and you have to support and maintain it. And then you have to figure out another paid product or another paid program by which you can actually generate revenue. And these are two very difficult things to do. We definitely, in the early days, did not know how we would monetize our open source project. But I think because of my co-founders' insistence and maybe like stubbornness to some extent, we realized, let's just do open source first and then we'll figure it out. And it did take us a long time. It's been like 3 years and we only started generating revenue a couple of months ago. Previously, I've done B2B startups and it's always been zero to revenue generation in literally like 90 days.
Yeah, you sign one contract and you're making money. Yeah,
you're making money. You can make money in like 3 months.
Very quick.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Versus an open source, it's just a lot slower. So if you are going to do an open source project, then you better be ready for a very, very long haul. Most open source projects don't monetize. Most of them will never make enough money even to pay the salary of one engineer working on that. That's the reality. So it's not something that I would recommend to most entrepreneurs, honestly.
Okay. That's a very sobering thought. I think with that, can we have the questions? So when you ask the question, I would just request that if you want any of the panelists to answer, or if you want any of the individuals to answer. So if you can just mention that when you ask the question, that would help. Yeah, so we can open. Yeah, I think there's a person there.
So like for open source projects, I guess the most is that once you create a large enough value proposition, like you give enough value for a user, then you can like capture a small set, and that is what runs the company, right? So like in the case of HashiCorp, like Terraform is like a a very common platform that developers use to manage the infrastructure. But once you reach that scale, how do you actually see like put up railguards so that the interest of the company comes first? Because then once they go public, there are a lot of other interests it's public, there are other investors in the company. So there is a chance that answers won't come first, right? So how do you set the guardrails for that?
So is that directed to all three or like any other specific? Okay. And if you want to take that.
So if I understand correctly, your question is, once a company has become a more advanced, mature company, and they have to start thinking about revenue, profitability, etc., how are they balancing that with the needs of their open source product? So my philosophy there is both of them have to be aligned. Uh, if you have a diversion there, which is what you need to do for your enterprise edition doesn't work well for your community edition, then I think you're going to be in trouble for sure. So I can tell you how we think about it at Appsmith. It's very similar to what GitLab does here, which is stuff that is around the developer experience and individual developers care about, that's in our open source edition. Things that their managers care about, or security people or buyers who have a real budget and a good idea of the business value that they will gain when they buy a product, the features that matter to them, those are the ones that we're charging for in our enterprise slash business edition. When it comes to a cloud-hosted, our pricing model is still not live, but the idea there is it's going to be a very simple consumption-based method of paying for it. My role as a CEO is definitely to ensure that the needs of the business and the needs of our open source free users, they're aligned. And I'm constantly trying to ensure we are all aligned on that exact same goal. Any deviation early on is just going to get exacerbated later, and it's definitely going to be complicated later. So that's something I focus on here.
And if you want to add to that?
I think it's again, so if you're building an open source company, community actually matters. So at any stage, you would have to think about the community. I think one of the good examples is like, when GitLab started adding telemetry information and started sending it to a third party, people actually responded. They have to take it back. They have to, rethink it and then come back with a different solution. So I think when you start building a business based on a community, there is always a risk that you have to think about the community in general, and you might make mistakes, but always I think you can go back and apologize and make it right. But yeah, having said that, community, if you're building a business on community, you have to consider that. But yeah,
I think there's a question there in the middle.
Yeah, so many of the themes that we were talking about in this panel discussion, so even if they were told in the context of open source projects, I think a lot of them apply to any business in India, right? So I basically want to specifically target one of the comments by Pranay, where he was talking about the side effects of having your project as open source, about having your dirty linen out in the public. So my question is, when does it start to matter whether you are open source or not? So basically, there are so many open source. If you just go to GitHub, even if your code is open, it's hidden in all the clutter. Right? So when does it start to matter, and when when are the risks of being open source actually get pronounced in the development community?
Yes, so I guess your question is right that even if the code is in public, right, how does it matter? Are people actually looking into it? Right? And that's a fair question. If it's in open, if nobody is looking at it, and there are many projects which nobody looks into, and it's fine, right? Though if your project which you put out and people find some value in it, right, then people will start sort of digging the project. That hey, what's happening there? And I guess maybe all of us would have seen some amount of interest from community, and then the people start seeing that hey, what's the issue, discussion, if somebody is taking some path, if the maintainers are taking some path, what's that path, right? And that's only where it matters, and there are many projects which are open source and nobody cares. But if people start caring, that's actually a good thing, in my opinion. And though the only thing is you should be comfortable being in a stage that hey, we are not perfect. We are also learning, and then take feedback from the community, right? What was your second question?
We're almost out of time. Can I give a chance to the person behind you who's been? Okay, yeah, quickly.
So, so even the answer that you just gave, in my brain, it kind of does not differentiate open source and
So fundamentally, you have to build a great product. Like being open source doesn't say that like, you don't have to build a great product, right? And this is what something I was talking to GitLab's founder Sid, and he was saying, hey, you're open source. That's like just one axis, that your code is open. That's about it, effectively, right?
And also, I'll tell you, I think all three of them will quickly agree, and we'll take one last question if that's okay. Is your most times open source users are also very vocal, right? If you worked in B2B software, you can say, hey, you know, you can to some extent be okay with like ignoring them, but I think it's very hard to do that with open source, because when one, you are community led. Second thing, they are also very vocal, right? So that is the difference between like having it proprietary and open source, right? You cannot, in some sense, afford, because as it is, you cannot sense to you know, afford, but open source because it's vocal and it's public. So yeah, one last question and then we'll end.
My question is, how do you protect your open source community or company from being overtaken by a larger corporation? Like what happened with MongoDB and Amazon, and MongoDB had to change their license. And similar thing happened with Elastic and Amazon, like Elasticsearch is now kind of equivalent of Amazon on AWS. So how do you prevent that from happening?
Yeah, I think there's always a risk that you know, in like another company or maybe like a multinational company can take your code and build their community around that product. But I think for us, it has some caveats, because it's not as easy as an infrastructure project like MongoDB or you know, any other infra project which you can list. There is a UI component to it, right? Like, you know, there is an application, there is a UI component to it, and if you are just putting the same thing out there, then like, you know, people might have their questions, and then there is like a lot of product thinking which is coming through that. It's not just the developer experience, there is also the customer experience as well, which also comes in. So I think, like, you know, if I take our project as an example, it is not that easy for a particular organization to just take it out and then, you know, fork it and then build their own version of software. But having said that, like, you know, the risk is always there, and I think one way you can mitigate that is, like, you know, to ensure that you can use a restrictive license like GPL or AGPL, and you can restrict that. But still, there is a fact that you know, they can actually publish the code and the variant of your code base in the same license. So I'm not sure, like, you know, whether there is a good answer on how to curb that. But yeah.
Yeah, so I just heard from the organizers that we can take a couple more questions. So yeah.
I am, I maintain Technology, which is an open source engineering platform, and we are in very early journey. So one thing that matters to us is, there are very few users which come in, come out, apart from the design partners and people from your network in the early stages. How do you really track the product usage after installation, not pre-installation, because there are many quantity tracking tools like Orbiter Cloud, etc. So how do you really track product usage post-installation, and how does the community react to it?
So I can maybe take a short stab at it. One is obviously you can have telemetry, but again, like, you know, people might not like that. But as long as you just have a ping to your server and say, hey, that product is live, that is one way. Many times also, if it is an infrastructure product, people might run agents, and that's also telemetry in a different way. The third thing, which is maybe less invasive from a privacy point of view, is how many users are actually downloading updates. Like, you know, are they kind of getting fixes, right? So, and assuming, like, most people who install software, especially if there is a security vulnerability, are they downloading fixes? That gives you, I won't say it gives you, telemetry probably gives a very good indication, but even like simple things like, you know, like downloads or, you know, getting updates, these kind of things, or like if you have an ID, for example, are they downloading plugins? So these kind of things actually can give you some idea of how much your usage is, because most people, I think in your case also, you may not care about the exact number, but I think most people would care about the trend or the directionality of it, and I think that tends to generally suffice. Any of you want to add to that?
I think the way to think about it is, of course, like to understand how your product is going, you need some sort of data on the user, etc. But it can be sort of aggregated metrics, right? That hey, this product was downloaded, or like so many people signed up. You don't need like exact page calls, etc. And you obviously, as an open source product, you lose some amount of telemetry and control, but that's the trade-off you have to make. So one is aggregated metrics. Second is sort of being public with whatever telemetry you are generated. What we have found is that if you are open about it, that hey, and publish in your docs that this is the telemetry which we collect, and also provide an option to disable the telemetry. That if somebody is really concerned about privacy, they do have an opt-out, right? And that should generally work. Like if somebody is really privacy concerned, doesn't want to home back anything, just disable the telemetry, right? But what you've seen is that most people are okay with some sort of aggregated metrics getting out, which can sort of guide your product direction. But of course, like you don't get as much data as a SaaS product would. But that's a trade-off.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I've seen certain companies, to win the trust of the users, they also actually show you what they're posting. Like even something like as simple as a crash report. I think Mozilla does that. You can see exactly what they're reporting, and you can see that okay, they are maybe taking the version and the other things. Then nothing private there, like you don't have your profile name, things like that. So you have to build that trust, and this is true again, like as somebody was saying, this is true for open source products as well, more so, but also for proprietary products. But the bar, as I said, is very high, much higher for open source projects. I think the worst thing that you can probably have is like you publish your code and you put in a lot of effort, nobody cares. Right? I think that is the worst thing that you can have. So I think these are in some sense good problems to have. Abhishek, you wanted to add anything?
No, nothing. I think Pranay has covered most of it. We have opt-in telemetry, and we see around 1/3 of our users opting into send us telemetry. It used to be as low as 15% when we started it, but over time, as the product has begun to look more trustworthy, more people have started sending us telemetry, and it's all anonymous telemetry. Obviously, we don't get data for the 70%, but it doesn't matter that much because you can understand where your product sucks by looking at just how 30% of your users are struggling through it, and that's honestly enough.
Yeah, I think just to add to the point, like as Pranay said, having a transparent communication is always required. Like what you collect and why you collect it, how you are going to use it. If you communicate that well, I think it is much easier to give it to the community. And I mean, as a founder, I think I always have this problem that we have this number of installations which are coming in, this number of downloads which are coming in. What is the feature which they are using, which we never get, right? That feedback, it's very hard to collect that feedback, and even if you add any kind of telemetry, at some point you would want which user did it, or what kind of user did it, what type of users, what type of usage was that, which is very hard to get. And I think as an alternative to that, how do you improve the product? That might be the reason why you're collecting data is to improve the product, right? So one of the ways which we do that is we have a cloud version of the software where we actually collect this metric and figure out where are people stuck, what are the points where we have to improve, and we take a decision based on that. And that's clear in our privacy policy. So for people who are on self-hosted, we collect only the aggregated metrics, like Pranay said, and we are very open about it. And for the cloud users, we still have an open policy. We collect the usage patterns so that it's easy for us to understand how the product works and what is it that that is preventing them from using the product.
Cool. I think we are out of time for questions. Sorry about that. I just want to add one last point before we end. One of the ways where I've seen users also do is they have this nightly channel, or I think in Rust, and maybe some other projects like Mozilla. They have the alpha, beta kind of channels, and then that's how they kind of get they get telemetry as well as they get opt-in users who can give one very good feedback and also, kind of test features, right? So that is also, so there are ways of working around this also, right? So there are, open source in that sense gives you so many different avenues to do, which would be slightly harder maybe. So while there are some pros, and there are some cons also. So like just like engineering or life, there are trade-offs. There's nothing like, there's no utopia. On that note, I would probably end it. Yeah, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed the panel.